Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It is Wednesday, June 15th, 2022. Uh, do you know what's going to happen in 4 days? It will be June 19th, 2022, or in regards to a national holiday we started commemorating last year when President Biden officially made it a national holiday through national legislation. It is Juneteenth. Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. What happened on that day? We've all heard of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, that was in 1863. But what happened after the war we thought ended and we get to June 19th, 1865? Well, I have two special shows today talking about Juneteenth. My first guest is an expert professional historian, professor on slavery, abolition, the Civil War. She is Manisha Sinha, and I'm going to introduce her now all the way from Germany. Hi, Manisha.
Hello, Sheila. It's good to be back.
Yes, it's good to be back. We had a wonderful show last time. I want to tell people about you, a little bit about your history before we go on to talking about how we came to Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. So Manisha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She is an expert on the history of slavery, abolition, feminism, Civil War, and Reconstruction. She's authored many things, but she is most famous in the intellectual and historical community for the book called The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which she wrote in 2016. That book has won the awards. It has won the National Book Award, long listed for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. It won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize at the 19th Annual Book Prize Awards, and so many other accolades for a prodigious book of unbelievable research. And it's important to talk about Manisha's thesis. And I get it. When we learned about abolition in school, we learned about Garrison, we learned about the Northerners and mostly many white abolitionists. Well, we learned about Frederick Douglass. But Manisha's point is that it was such a multi-layered, long historical march. It didn't start in the 1800s. It started with colonial times as people were coming to this country from around the world and the slave trade started. Isn't that your thesis? And not only that, Manisha, but it was the slaves themselves who were very instrumental in the abolition cause. And this is left out of so much of our traditional history that we learn in school. Talk about that.
Yes. So my book on abolition, as you mentioned, takes a longer view of the abolition movement. It goes right back to the 17th and 18th centuries and moves forward to the 19th century and the Civil War. It also argues that slave resistance was central to the making of abolition, and that enslaved people themselves, whether it was through rebellions or suing their enslavers for freedom, or simply voting with their feet and running away and becoming leaders in the abolition movement, like Frederick Douglass, writing their slave narratives, which became what I call the movement literature of abolition, that they played a central role in the abolition movement. And that is not to downplay the role of white abolitionists like Garrison, but it is really to reimagine abolition as a radical interracial social movement of ordinary people, of ordinary men and women, blacks and whites.
Right. And like so many other social movements throughout our history, it doesn't take one generation to get something accomplished. It takes years and many, many generations. And it takes the interrelationship, as you show in your book, about the feminist movement combined with the abolition movement, the Quaker movement, various different kinds of contingencies of Americans who shared in the movement in one way or another. So that's a very important thing that we want to talk about. But let's get back to basics. You know, there are Americans today who have a very traditional and very unrealistic, maybe, view of American history through the eyes of the kind of textbooks we read in high school growing up. And they don't like the idea of 1619 as the beginning of our American experiments and so on. Talk about that. When did slavery start in America? And is 1619 a date as important as 1776 to our culture and our history?
So, yes, as you know, history has become rather controversial. Teaching of American history has become somewhat controversial. But, as a historian and as a US historian, I would argue that we tell only partial or incomplete stories if we leave out large chunks of our history. And to really appreciate United States history, and if you're a true patriot, and you really do want to understand your country, you need to understand its history in all its complexities, in all its nuances. History is not a report card. Well, it's not made to make you feel good or bad. It's not meant for you to get an A or an F. History, like any other social science, should be based on evidence and our understanding of what actually happened in the past. And most historians, whatever their private views are or their political views are, approach their subject conscientiously. They research their subject and they write it. So when it comes to the 1619 project, I think one of the reasons why it became so controversial is because most American citizens are quite unfamiliar with the history of slavery. And slavery was not a sideshow in American history, it was the main show. If you think about the Civil War that was fought over slavery, this is a war in which over 700,000 Americans died, more Americans than both the World Wars, the Vietnam War, the Korean War combined. So this is a huge event in US history. It really remakes our political structure with those constitutional amendments that come about immediately after the Civil War with the end of slavery. So it's really important to understand that. Now, of course, African Americans or people of African descent, I should say, were in the North American continent before 1619. They came with the Spanish conquistadors. They were here before the Pilgrims. They were here before Jamestown in the 16th century in areas that are now part of the United States, like Florida and the Southwest. So maybe we should know that. But I think 1619 has become somewhat of a marker because that's when the first slaves arrived in British North America, in Jamestown. And the idea is not to displace other events, I would argue, but to put them in context, to understand that all 13 colonies on the eve of the American Revolution had slavery, and that the northern colonies, which became the northern states, got rid of slavery only during the Revolutionary era. And that sort of sets up the fight between the free North and the slave South. It's not as if Black people were totally equal in many states in the North, though a handful of New England states, except Connecticut, did give Black men the right to vote before the Civil War. The point still remains that there was a division over the issue of slavery that led to the war. So, yes, we can look at the histories of slavery. We should also look at the histories of abolition, the fight against slavery. That's as much a part of American history as slavery. And those people who want to restrict the teaching of slavery and its long afterlives don't understand that, why would you identify with that? Why not identify with white abolitionists rather than enslavers who committed
Right.
treason against the American Republic in the name of human bondage?
Right.
So it's
Manisha, yeah.
a story. And I think most Americans should not be interested in sort of trying to toe a party line the way, let's say, it's being done in Putin's Russia, but rather really fully understand American history. There should be no
Yes.
censorship.
So, Manisha, before we go any further, I want to tell our viewers, those who tuned into our last show, we were talking just about that whole issue of intellectual freedom, about history, and the fact that so many legislatures and states around this country are not allowing teachers to teach history in the way that they gave them any intellectual freedom, and the whole idea of this critical race theory being taught, which minimizes the importance of American freedom and makes our children feel uncomfortable because, as you said, why do we have to identify with the enslavers? Why don't we identify with the enslaved or the abolitionists? And this got you in trouble. You had death threats against you that had to be taken care of by the police authorities just for writing your views and going against the racism, the ignorance, and the Trumpism that is rife in our culture today, right? That was all you were doing, was giving your historical expertise and your opinions and telling people that you can't allow racism and ignorance to lead the way. But sadly, I don't think things have gotten better since that happened to you. Do you?
Well, I do think we overcome perhaps one of the worst periods in American history a little bit, even though the threat is not completely gone. I think critical race theory has been made into a political football. No one has died because of critical race theory, but people have been killed because of this so-called great replacement theory that is being touted. It's a neo-fascist idea. In fact, that idea first was propounded in the early 20th century and gave rise to fascist ideologies in Europe that the United States fought against. I mean, this is important, I think, for all Americans to remember, students of American history, but all ordinary American citizens to remember that we fought against slaveholders, that the American Republic survived that, and that we fought against fascism and Nazism in Europe. So people today who espouse those ideas are not patriots. They are traitors to the United States, and they espouse ideas that are un-American. So for them to assume the garb of American patriotism is the height of I don't know of impudence. I would say, that this is when you espouse ideas that are so un-American in terms of everything that this country has overcome and it continues to try to overcome, and you sow racial divisions and you purposely sow hatred against people, whether they're immigrants or people who look differently than you. I mean, let's remember that the true Native Americans here were Native Americans, American Indians. We are all guests on their land. So, I have no patience for these people because they have been indoctrinated so badly by, ill-meaning people with bad intentions, or those who just for their own short-term political gain are willing to jeopardize our experiment in democratic government. I have no patience for these people. You talked about the death threat I received. It was actually a pretty innocuous article I had written for CNN comparing Andrew Johnson, who was one of the worst presidents in American history, who succeeded Lincoln when he was assassinated and who was very racist and tried to undo the gains of the Civil War, including the fight for Black rights in this country. And he was impeached. And at that time, Donald Trump was impeached for the first time. Now he has the distinction of being the only American president who was impeached twice. But I just did a comparative piece between Andrew Johnson and Trump. And that was what elicited a death threat from one of his blind followers who resides in Texas. And thanks to my wonderful New England community, both my university and the police force of my hometown, they got together, they identified this man and they immediately read the riot act to him. So I felt, I felt I should maybe not talk so publicly, politically anymore. But my husband, who's German, told me, no, you must continue because this is exactly what the Nazis did. They would frighten everyone into silence or compliance. And that is the way democracy loses, is when we, are too scared and too timid to
Right,
raise
right.
our voices against bad
Yes,
ideas and
yes.
atrocities.
Very important that people like you speak out. But just want to leave this topic and go on to the origins of Juneteenth. However, just one more comment. Um, I have been waiting. I taught history many years ago before going on to law school, and I taught history. Got called on the carpet for doing things that some American teachers are doing now. But why aren't the American teachers, not just in the universities, but in the even elementary and high schools, why aren't they rising up in protest against these rules about how they are to teach, what subjects they are not to touch, what words they're not allowed to use in teaching the truths of American history? Do you have any opinion on that? Have you seen a rising up of the
Well,
intellectual community?
it's really become a dangerous job in this country to be a teacher. You can be attacked by a small group, in many cases, a loud minority that hijacks school board meetings, that misleads well-intentioned parents, that gets politicians, especially from this current day incarnation of the Republican Party as a completely sort of Trumpist, neo-fascist, racist organization virtually, and intimidates these teachers. There'll be penalties to pay if you teach a certain thing. These things happen in authoritarian regimes. It happens in Viktor Orban's Hungary. It happens in Putin's Russia. It happened in Nazi Germany when they burned books and they scapegoated people, and they only wanted a national story, a mythic story to be told. And that's exactly the part that these people who attack teachers do that. So I am in sympathy with teachers. I work with high school teachers. I do summer seminars with them in terms of trying to see how the latest scholarship in American history can be brought to the classroom. I feel sorry for their students who are being deprived then sometimes by law to be taught something. So, teachers are fighting back. You know how the teachers' unions are always demonized by the right. But we are expecting so much from our American teachers, having to sort of not be able to teach freely, to have their academic freedom jeopardized, and to have even standards of learning changed in certain red states, laws passed that criminalize the teaching of the histories of slavery and racism. These are terrible, terrible developments. It's the development of an illiberal, neo-fascist, authoritarian mindset. And that's what schools combat. That's what education is supposed to combat. It combats ignorance and hatred with knowledge and understanding, including of people who may not be like you, and including about the histories and lives of people who may have had different experiences than the histories and lives of groups that you identify with. So, this is important for us to teach. It is an important lesson in American civics to create an American nationality, to create American citizenship. So I find these bad faith efforts really awful. Instead, they want teachers to be armed and to be tackling mass shooters. They think, people can bring guns into areas, but not books. I mean,
Right.
think about that mindset. So I am more in sympathy with the teachers. There are teachers who fought back. There are teachers who've been fired in many of these red states for doing a certain thing, looking a certain way, being a certain person. And these are dangerous things to do. I also think this is a concerted attack on the public school system. the public school system of the United States is one of our great democratic institutions. It attempts to level the playing field. Of course, we don't, because schools are funded through local neighborhoods, and richer neighborhoods have more resources, and we see all these differentials according to class and race in education. But the public school system is something to be prized. The South didn't have it. Slaveholders didn't want it. The Free North had it. But after the Civil War, the Reconstruction governments introduced the public school systems in the South. Of course, during the Civil Rights Movement, they became ground zero for fights over integration in the South. And in the South now, you have these so-called segregation academies, private academies, and severely underfunded public schools. So they've been attacking the public school systems since the days of slavery.
Right.
And they don't want to be taxed to support the education of all fellow citizens, including those who are too poor to send their kids maybe to private school. So I see this as an attack, not just on teachers, but also on our wonderful public school systems. Growing up in a poor country like India, I know that is something that every country aspires to. The United States has achieved it, but the right in this country has launched an unremitting warfare against education, against teachers, against the public school system, against knowledge itself.
Right. Another part of this whole hot button issue is, and I wonder your thoughts on it, when we look at slavery today, do we look at it from our own optic of the views that we have now, or do we look at it from the optic of the people that were living at the time? And that brings up the whole issue of, what do we think of Thomas Jefferson now? What do we think of all of those statues of people that we considered the heroes of American democracy, who were very much not Democrats when it came to the issues of race and racism? And your book talks about all of those complexities. How are we to approach that today? Are we to say that Jefferson was wrong in his day? Because while Jefferson was alive, there were visionaries. There were people who were fighting slavery and who were fighting for abolition of slavery.
Absolutely. So when you look at the founding generation of, the American founders, and it's particularly the Southern founders, many of whom were slaveholders, especially the Virginia dynasty, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. And then you compare them to the Northern founding fathers, many of whom were also slaveholders, right? Or involved in slaveholding either through marriage or through inheritance. People like John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. John Adams was never a slaveholder. But, in the North, many of the Northern founding fathers went along with their states eventually and gave up their involvement in slavery. In the South, the only Southern founding father who does this is George Washington. He frees his slaves on his death. But before that, even he is pursuing his runaway slave like Ona Judge. Thomas Jefferson is probably the most complex of them all, because he has these asides against slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. He does not free his enslaved people except those that he begat because of his, if you can call it, a relationship with Sally Hemings, right? And so Jefferson is a complex figure. In theory, he deplores interracial mixture, but then he has this relationship with this woman who's a half sister of his dead wife, meaning she's the progeny of an illicit relationship between his father-in-law and his enslaved woman. So it's a very complex, incestuous story, right? But the problem with Jefferson is that even though he writes these things against slavery, he is, continues to be a slaveholder, and is also a bit of a racist, dabbles in ideas of the permanent racial inferiority of Black people, maybe to excuse the fact that he never does free his slaves, even though many people, both in France and in England and also in the United States, look to Jefferson He's seen as the main author of the Declaration of Independence, as the man who came up with the idea of universal natural rights, declaring the equality of all men. He doesn't say all white men, he says all men. And so he is, he needs to explain why he's not doing this. So he comes up with a lot of, I think, blatantly racist excuses. But I'm not one of those people who thinks that the statues of the founders should be taken down because they were slaveholders. When we think of people like Jefferson and Washington, we have to keep in mind that that is not the main thing that they're known for. They were, again, complex figures like the American Republic that they begat, that continue to have slavery, but also espouse ideas that were theoretically anti-slavery, including this idea of the Declaration, which many Southerners actually repudiated on the eve of the Civil War because they thought it was too abolitionist. So I, as a Civil War historian, was completely for the taking down of statues of Confederate leaders. They were not only slaveholders, they had committed treason against the American Republic in order to defend slavery. There was no redeeming quality to their statues. They had done nothing good, really, but everything bad. And there was no way that you could even explain those statues. And they were put up by Southerners to actually commemorate the fall of Reconstruction and to commemorate the rise of white supremacy in the South between the period of around 1890 to 1920. This is the height of racist terror against Black people, the establishment of Jim Crow, the disfranchisement of Black men. So all in all, these statues are bad, and anything that commemorates the Confederacy in a public place should completely be done away with in the United States. Our tax dollars should not fund any of that. So I was very happy to see, after the murder of George Floyd, all these Confederate statues come down. And as a historian, I applauded them. These statues had no redeeming quality. They didn't tell the history. In fact, they told mythic ideas about the past that went against the actual history of what had happened in the United States. So I was quite happy to see them go. But when it comes to the statues of the founding fathers, including Jefferson, Washington, Madison, we can, in fact, say that they're slaveholders. We can point out to the flaws, even flaws in their careers, in their character, because they were not demigods. They were human beings, right? They were not abolitionists, even though they were abolitionists during their times, who fought to end slavery, including African Americans and white people. They were abolitionist societies. Some of our founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin, towards the end of his life, lent the prestige of his name to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He became the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, something that Jefferson, Washington, none of them did. They didn't want to be involved with the abolition movement. So we can talk about that. We can have explanations and plaques with their statues. But I don't think we should buy into what Trump said, which is like, if we take down Confederate statues, then we are going down a slippery slope where we're going to take down all statues. I'm actually against that. As a historian, I feel it's really important to retain the statues of the American founders, but to be able to judge them, as I do in my book, according to the abolitionist standard, and see where they did well and where they may be wanting.
Yeah, it brings to mind a couple of other questions that I'm thinking of. So in the South, was slavery more primary in the South because of the economic necessities than the North? And the other question it brings to mind is, were you able to justify enslaving someone else because you could easily come to the realization in your own mind that they were inferior? And that brings me to some of the things as you just mentioned, that even Jefferson talked about having to do, I hate even to bring up the subject, having to do with orangutans and the quality of lives of the enslaved, and also others, like even President Lincoln, in one of the speeches that he made in that whole series of Lincoln Douglas debates, talked against the Black community as inferior in some ways. So it is so complex. I want you to address all of
Yeah.
that, all of those questions.
Oh, those are a lot of questions there.
I know, I know.
So, yes, I think Jefferson really flirted with the so called new science of man, the pseudoscience of race, which we know today to be a pseudoscience. And so Southerners really use that to defend slavery, right? They use racist ideas to defend slavery. And I think that's one of the main ways in which Jefferson kind of excuses himself for not following through on his own anti slavery principles. But Lincoln was not a hard and fast racist like Jefferson. I would not put him in the same category. And even the economic necessity argument makes no sense because, yes, slavery was central to the plantation economy of the South, but there were many areas in the North where slavery was pretty established. If you look at the Narragansett Valley or the Hudson Valley, there were large slaveholders using slave labor. After Charleston, South Carolina, New York City was the largest hub of urban slavery. Northern ports were completely enmeshed in the slave trade, and ending slavery in the northern states was a huge and bitter fight that abolitionists had to fight because northern slaveholders resisted it and they were powerful politically. So they had more clout than even their percentage of the population would give idea of hope. So yes, maybe slavery was not as economically important in the North as the South, but that does not excuse that. You know, during the Revolutionary era, you do have a moment when ideological criticisms of slavery reaches a kind of a crescendo. There are even many instances of large scale manumissions in upper South states like Virginia and Maryland and Delaware. In fact, in Maryland, half the Black population becomes free after the Revolutionary era, even though it remains a slave state. It doesn't secede from the Union, it stays within the Union. So, the economic argument that people have always conventionally made, oh, the North freed because it was economically, no, they didn't. Because Northern slaveholders and Northern economic elites resisted it bitterly. And you can find evidence of that. And I talk about that in my book. And again, to go back, I would not put Lincoln in the same category as Jefferson. Lincoln never speculated on Black inferiority the way Jefferson did. But Lincoln was a politician. And during the Lincoln Douglas debates, he was always on this defensive on the question of Black equality. Stephen Douglas, against whom he was running for the Senate in the famous Lincoln and Douglas debates of 1858, and which he lost, by the way. But then, of course, he won the presidency in 1860 because those speeches sort of made him throughout the country. Basically, Lincoln is from Illinois, which did not give Black people citizenship rights. Lincoln flirts with colonization, a movement that many abolitionists opposed, which is to colonize all free Black people back to Africa. Even Jefferson had recommended that. So throughout the 1850s, Lincoln is a colonizationist. He refuses to endorse equal Black political rights when he is asked to sign petitions to give Black men the right to vote in Illinois. He refuses to do that. But Lincoln does say that Black people are equal human beings, that they should get the benefits of the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration, and that no one has the right to enslave them. And he has wonderful arguments on that, some public and some that were actually found in his papers later on, in his private papers. Publicly, he says he uses a Black woman, not even a man, to talk about human equality. He says, maybe she's not my equal politically, but in her right to earn her living and to be free and not to be enslaved, she is indeed my equal. So not only does he use a figure of a Black person, but a Black woman. And this is publicly in the Lincoln Douglas debates when Douglas is accusing him of being, quote, an end lover, of being a Black Republican who believes in racial equality and racial intermarriage. The Democrats at that time really used these notions, racist notions, to oppose the movement to abolish slavery. And for your viewers who are confused, everything you know about the Republican and Democratic Party today, you need to just flip it. For the 19th century, the Democratic Party was the party of the South. It was the party of slavery, of racism. And the Republican Party, which had newly emerged as an anti-slavery party, was the party of racial liberalism, big government. It was the party of Lincoln. And so Lincoln was on the defensive because Douglas is always accusing him of this, and he knows that Illinois does not give the right to vote to Black men. And it has these Black laws that discriminate against Black people, even in terms of them coming into the state of Illinois and settle there. So there's a long history of discrimination. So as a politician, he's very careful to say, I'm not for Black equality. But Lincoln is not a racist. Or even his ideas when he says, oh, if there has to be a superior race and an inferior race, then he tells Douglas, then I guess as a white man, I would prefer it if I was the superior rather than inferior. He never says, I am superior because of this. And if you look at all his speeches, his reaction to the Dred Scott decision, which says that Black men have no rights that a white man is bound to respect, or his logical refutation of racism, which is in a piece of paper that I found while I was, it's published in the Lincoln Papers, in the Basler volumes, but most historians hadn't made much of it. And I found it while I was researching an article on Lincoln and the abolitionists for this volume, Our Lincoln. And in that, he has an amazing argument against racism, where he says, he has it like a logical problem. He says, A tells B, I'm going to enslave you because you are Black and I'm white, you're darker than me. And he says, beware, the first person who's fairer than you has the right to enslave you. Then he says, oh, it's not a matter of skin color, it's a matter of intelligence. You say, then beware, the first person who's more intelligent than you has the right to enslave you. And so he does this reductio ad absurdum argument, showing the fallacy of racism. So I think it's really important. Lincoln is a complex figure. He changes his position on colonization. By the end of the war, he becomes the first American president to endorse Black citizenship publicly. He says, Black men who served in the Union Army, who are educated, who are particularly worthy, should have the right to vote. And it is that speech that gets him killed. John Wilkes Booth, his assassin, this neo-Confederate sympathizer, his Confederate sympathizer, says, well, that means Black equality. He says it in a more rude way. This means I'm going to kill him. So he kills him, this Maryland actor, not because he was the so-called great emancipator, because he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but because he's the first American president to publicly endorse Black citizenship. Wow. So I think it's really important to know this history, because even people who are well-intentioned, trying to score political points, sometimes simplify our past. And as a historian, as a scholar, I'm always saying, wait a minute, you need to step back and you need to understand why abolitionists like Garrison liked Lincoln so much, even though he was not an abolitionist.
Right. Very interesting. So, Manisha, you're just exposing by your talking all of the complexities, the nuances that, of course, we don't get in school, and that as educated Americans, we're supposed to want to keep opening our minds to new information, to new understandings, and you do that so beautifully in your talk today and in all of your writings. And you mentioned the word manumission, so I just wanted to go over a little bit on that, because all during this period, from colonial until the Civil War and even beyond, there were slave owners freeing their slaves personally, either through their wills that they wrote or during their lifetimes. There were slaves that actually, so interesting, went to court, freedom suits, if they had some reason that maybe they weren't of 100% slave origin, had some free men in their background or something. all of that is very interesting. And then to combine that with the whole idea of the Fugitive Slave Act, every state had different rules as to who was a slave and who could be taken away from their slave owners and who could be returned. It's very complex, and so many different strains are going on at the same time, right?
Exactly. And these manumissions many times were the results of deals that enslaved people struck with slave owners. They bought their own freedom at times. So it was not even just a matter of, quote, slaveholders' benevolence. Many enslaved people struck these deals with their enslavers and sometimes were cheated because these were not legally enforceable. Unlike slavery in the Spanish areas where you had a law where you could legally purchase yourself and your owner couldn't hoodwink you so easily. They still did that there too, but at least you had these laws in place. In the United States, many slave owners made their enslaved people sometimes pay for themselves like two, three times over, or sometimes just pocketed the money and didn't free them. Or sometimes slave owners freed their enslaved people in their wills, but their children and their progeny and their heirs disputed it and reversed it. So you
Right.
have these cases. So it's a very complex story, and there were many people who the only people who are really struggling for their freedom are, of course, enslaved people, black people, and occasionally they find white allies, usually with abolitionists. Many of them go on the abolitionist lecture circuit to raise money to buy themselves, to buy their families, etc. And Garrison said, I don't believe in compensated emancipation. If anyone deserves compensation, it's enslaved people. But let's think of this as paying a ransom, he said, to a kidnapper, and therefore give money to people like Frederick Douglass who are trying to buy themselves out of slavery.
Right. Interesting. So now I want to talk about the whole idea that you put in your book that the abolitionist movement started way in colonial times and before even, that the world is also dealing with slavery. We won't go into it too much now, but the country of Haiti had a revolution where they were probably the first to abolish slavery in the hemisphere. Uh, all the nations of the world are dealing with it. It's not a problem solely for the Americas. But now when we create this constitution after the revolution and the Articles of Confederation, we need to establish the Constitution, and we have to take account of slavery somehow in the Constitution, don't we? It has to be in there in the number, how we count the slaves for representation purposes. And there's even in the Constitution, I bet many people don't know this, what has come to be called the Fugitive Slave Clause. Talk about that.
Yes. So, of course, Haiti is the one revolution that we don't learn much about, but it is pretty much the Haitian Revolution is part of the age of revolution. It should be taught with the American and French Revolution. And, that entire age ends with the Latin American Wars of Independence. We in the United States tend to be a little insular, and we never learn about Haiti or the Spanish American republics that abolished slavery on gaining independence. Of course, Haiti is the only instance of a successful slave rebellion in world history, and they established a Black republic. And just recently, the New York Times did a wonderful sort of expose on how Haiti was made into this poor and unstable country by its former colonizers and enslavers, the French, and later by the United States. They literally calculated how much money France got out of Haiti after its revolution. And in current dollar terms, it's worth billions of dollars. They based their article on the work of scholars who have done this before, but they actually calculate the exact amount, which I thought was rather amazing. But to go back to this issue of the founding of nations, Haiti is founded as an abolitionist republic, a Black republic, an anti-slavery republic. The United States, as I mentioned earlier, the northern states passed gradual emancipation laws that eventually end slavery, starting with Vermont in 1777 and ending with New Jersey in 1804. But the southern states don't, and slavery doesn't die there. It actually expands and becomes stronger. So you have this situation when the nation is founded and the Constitution is written that there's a powerful slave interest. And especially the slaveholders from the Deep South, from South Carolina and Georgia, where the Cotton Kingdom first takes off in the 1790s, are very concerned about having some protections for slavery. A lot of enslaved people have run away during the Revolutionary War, either to fight for the Continental Army, but many to the British, and have won their freedom. So the first concession they get is they said, because the African slave trade was seen as an awful trade that was, full of tortures and cruelty, even by people who supported slavery, said, we are not for the African slave trade because that's a particularly egregious and bad trade. In the Middle Passage, the tortures of people and the amount of people who die and who are diseased because of it, the cruelty of it was too appalling, and abolitionists, especially in Britain, had exposed that. So the Deep South states, they demand, when the Constitution is being written, that the slave trade be continued until 1808, that it not be abolished. So South Carolina reopens the African slave trade and gets thousands of more Africans in order to make up for its losses virtually during the Revolutionary War, and in order to feed this expanding cotton kingdom in the upcountry. So here we have, again, one clause of the United States Constitution that ostensibly looks anti-slavery because it says the Constitution the US government can abolish the African slave trade in 1808, but basically they couldn't do it before that. So the slave trade, the foreign slave trade, gets a lease of life until then. Then there's the 3/5 clause, which counts the slave population in the South, ironically, to give more power to slaveholders. Slaveholders they wanted their slave population to be counted as a whole. The compromise was 3/5. Northerners didn't want slave population to be counted for representation in Congress and federal government because enslaved people didn't vote, but
Right.
Southerners wanted it. So the compromise was the 3/5 clause that said 3/5 of the slave population will be counted for representation, and that gave slaveholders a lock on the federal government until Abraham Lincoln's election. And that's why they secede. They lose control. They lose the elections. Sounds familiar? They
Yeah.
refuse to accept the results of a presidential election, and they leave the Union and start a fratricidal and long civil war. So the 3/5 clause gives them extra representation in the Electoral College, in Congress, and within their own governments, within the state governments of the South. So these are really great protections for slavery in the US Constitution. Finally, you get the Fugitive Slave Clause that says that any person who owes service, renders service, shall be, in fact, taken back to the South. It was eventually implemented by federal law in 1790, which was completely made even more draconian in 1850. But it's a clause that gives slaveholders rights to the service of the enslaved people, even if they run to territories that are free. Because when the Constitution is being written in 1787, they're already seeing northern states pass these gradual emancipation laws. Massachusetts in 1780, judicial decision gets rid of slavery, 1783, the state of Pennsylvania, then Rhode Island and Connecticut, and everyone is passing these laws, and they can see the writing on the wall, and so they get this guarantee. Interestingly, the founding fathers felt embarrassed enough never to use the word slave or slavery in the US Constitution. They only used euphemisms, persons held to service. But everyone knew that, of course, that meant slavery. Now, since then, abolitionists, historians, they keep debating, is the US Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? Many abolitionists said it's pro-slavery because of these protections for slavery. Others who were political abolitionists said, no, it's kind of anti-slavery in spirit. And this is the position that Frederick Douglass would eventually subscribe to. And they said, if you look at the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, if you just apply that to enslaved people, then slavery is not valid. If you even apply the constitutional clause that says the federal government guarantees a republican form of government with a small r, meaning a representative form of government to all the states, that slavery should be illegal in all these southern states because they don't have full democracy or representative government. So they came up with all kinds of ideas and they debated this. And to me, what's more interesting is not to say the slavery is anti-slavery or pro-slavery, but to say that the Constitution had these protections for slavery, but that slaveholders eventually interpreted it in even more pro-slavery manner. And abolitionists try to interpret it in anti-slavery ways to use it against slavery. So instead of trying to sort of figure out, is this anti-slavery, pro-slavery, what is the intent, as if we can know the original intent of founders. There are a lot of conservative legal theorists who go after that, which is, I think, ahistorical and completely anachronistic. We should figure out what the Constitution gives us in terms of our democracy and our rights, and think of ways to expand those rather than try and restrict it. That's what political abolitionists did. That's what the anti-slavery Republicans under Lincoln did with the Civil War and Reconstruction. And that's what we should be doing today.
Right. So, as you said, they had to accommodate the slave-owning population in making the Constitution. And you're right, there's a myriad of reasons and rationales that you can come up with for, is it pro-slavery or not? It was necessary to create the Union, right? To create the Constitution. It had to be done in some fashion. Otherwise, the Southern slave-owning states would not have joined. Isn't that right? They had to make some accommodations for it.
Absolutely. Even some of the people like Franklin, etc., who were anti-slavery, they put the Union above trying to completely get rid of slavery.
Exactly.
The only people who are fighting to completely get rid of slavery and who see the founding of the Republic as the perfect moment actually to get rid of it are abolitionists. And ironically, of course, the British monarchy, and this is something that abolitionists always held to the shame of the slaveholding republic before the war, is that the British monarchy got rid of slavery before us.
Really? Yeah. So now we're going to move toward that Juneteenth date. You already talked about slavery starting. Maybe just a very short word about the importance of the Dred Scott decision. We just talked about the fugitive slave clause and how the Dred Scott decision was a very big disappointment to the abolitionist movement, and how that was one of the triggers for the Civil War leading up to it.
Yes, so the Dred Scott decision of 1857 is one of those Supreme Court decisions that should belong to what legal theorists call the anti-canon, meaning, it should not be part of our legal tradition. You know how we build precedents? So the Dred Scott decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, there are a lot of these decisions that the Supreme Court has made over the years that have been undemocratic, un-American, and should be reviled. I remember there was a nominee for the vice presidency of the United States who, in a question and answer session, could not name a single Supreme Court decision she disagreed with. So I always teach this to my students. I tell them, if you ever run for political office, know that if you ask that question, you can always say the Dred Scott decision. So what was the Dred Scott decision? Now, Dred Scott was an enslaved man from Missouri who sued for his freedom. And initially, it included his wife, Dred and Harriet Scott. But the case that eventually reached the Supreme Court was just Dred Scott. And he sued for his freedom because he had been to free territory. And he won his suit. But his enslaver and his enslaver's inheritors then finally appealed this decision right up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was stacked with pro-slavery Southern Democrats, and the Chief Justice was Roger Taney, who was a Jacksonian Democrat and had freed his own slaves, but had made increasingly pro-slavery decisions. and had become very identified with the slavery interests. And in 1857, he tried to, through a Supreme Court decision, solve a political matter, which is completely overstepping the bounds of his authority and that of the Supreme Court. He denied Dred Scott's appeal, and he said that Dred Scott had no standing as an enslaved person to even sue for his freedom, even though this tradition of suing for your freedom, as you mentioned in my book, goes right back to the colonial era. And enslaved people had been doing that a lot, especially in St. Louis, Missouri, where Dred Scott had sued for his freedom. Many had won their freedom over various issues. So Tawney says, in an egregious thing, that a black man has no rights, which a white man is bound to respect. So this is a real blow against the abolition movement, because abolitionists, of course, are fighting not just to end slavery, but also for black citizenship and equality. That's what distinguishes an abolitionist from just an anti-slavery person. They believed theoretically and formally, however they may have behaved personally, their platform was end slavery and get black equality, black citizenship. But it was also a blow against the newly formed anti-slavery Republican Party, which was not an abolitionist party. Its platform was what we call the lowest common denominator of anti-slavery, which was the non-expansion of slavery into the West, meaning Lincoln's idea, let's not admit any more slave states, so that eventually free states will outnumber the original slave states and slavery would gradually disappear, that the republic would continue to stand for freedom rather than slavery. So the Dred Scott decision, a part of it which is often forgotten, was also that the federal government had no right to abolish slavery in the federal territories. The territories, which were not yet states, but were directly under the federal government. Like even the District of Columbia was directly under the federal government. And this was the demand of many anti-slavery politicians that, okay, the southern states don't want to abolish slavery. Let's at least abolish slavery in those areas where the federal government can constitutionally do that. And those were territories under the control of the federal government. So by saying this, by saying that slavery should expand into the territories and the federal government had no right for it, basically he was saying the platform of the newly formed Republican Party was unconstitutional. Of course, Lincoln and the Republican Party, Lincoln's famous speech on the Dred Scott decision said this is nonsense, that we do not accept this Supreme Court decision, that we are, in fact, our position is the constitutional position.
Right.
So the Dred Scott decision was bad because it was also against big government, against the federal government interfering in slavery, even in areas where it constitutionally could do that.
Right. So let's turn to now the leading up to Juneteenth as the war has started. And can you see this? Manisha, can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. We know that the war theoretically ended with the Appomattox, but that's not true, right? It continued to have some battles and some surrenders after that, right?
Yes. So, Appomattox is the big moment of surrender because it's the end of the Army of North Virginia and it's Lee's surrender. It's the biggest surrender. But you're right. There are some other Confederate forces that actually surrender after that, too. What's interesting about Juneteenth is that it does not take place in Texas until 1865, June 19th, 1865, until the Union Army arrives there. So this is something important to remember about emancipation, including when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that you've gotten up, is that the only way emancipation could be enforced was if the Union Army actually got to that place. Mm-hmm. Because before that, you had slavery. Enslaved people were running into Union Army lines to win their freedom. But those areas that were far from them, like Texas, did not actually, the enslavers there did not free their enslaved people right until the end of the war, till actually General Gordon Granger got to Galveston, Texas, and issued this proclamation about Juneteenth, right? And of course, it was, a military order. He even said to the enslaved people, this doesn't mean you can just like walk off and not work anymore. You still have to labor for wages. It has that conservative sort of ending to it. But it began by saying that you're no longer enslaved. You
Right.
cannot be held to slavery, and certainly enslaved people in Texas viewed it as an emancipation proclamation and have celebrated Juneteenth since then to mark the coming of the Union Army and the final end to slavery. And so it was a
Right.
very Texas specific holiday. But in fact, we know that slave owners in the Confederacy, in that red area that you have up there, were also when the Union Army came, enslaved people ran towards it, and slave owners and enslavers ran away from it. And many of them forcibly took their enslaved population with them and refugied them. That's what they call them, refugeeing your slaves, the deliberate act of making their own enslaved people into wartime refugees. And they took them with them to Texas, from Louisiana, where the Union Navy had already landed in 1862, even all the way far from South Carolina, slaveholders came with their slaves. So even though it's a Texas specific holiday, it involved the whole South in terms of these representations of enslaved populations from other states. So this Texas holiday was not very well known except to historians of slavery and certainly to African Americans who started commemorating it more recently as an Emancipation Day. That's the general order from General Gordon Granger informing enslaved, and that's 1865, not 1965.
Oh.
Who would
Thank
want
you.
enslaved people to be?
Thank you. I will correct that right away. Thank you.
And so June 19th, 1865, that's when the order is issued. More recently, it's being celebrated more and more like a national holiday by Black people. And now, of course, it has become a national holiday. President Joe Biden in 2021 correctly, I think, argued that you need to have one holiday that marks the end of slavery. We don't have it in the United States, and now Juneteenth has become that National Emancipation Day. I should also mention, Sheila, that African Americans have a long tradition of celebrating emancipation. They celebrated the end of the African slave trade in 1808 with speeches and commemorations. They celebrated the end of slavery in the northern states in the 1820s. They celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st. They celebrated the passage of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution in 1865. So they have a long tradition of celebrating Emancipation Day. So as a historian of slavery and abolition, I'm really glad that we now have a national holiday that marks the end of slavery and that commemorates emancipation.
Right. Thank you. We saw in that last slide, and I have some others that I'm going to show when I interview Ben Haith, who is going to be another guest of mine because he is a resident of Norwich, Connecticut, and he designed the Juneteenth flag. And we're going to talk to him about his experiences and how he did that. But you can see from just in 1900 that the Black communities in Texas and other areas in the South were celebrating with festivals for Juneteenth way before it became recognized as a state holiday or as a national holiday, right?
Absolutely. Black people in Texas celebrated it historically, even in 1900, when the promise of emancipation has been completely betrayed and Black men are disfranchised, and you have lynching and racist terror and sharecropping and debt peonage and segregation and Jim Crow. Even then, they marked it. And I would recommend a really good book on this, written by the eminent historian and legal historian Annette Gordon Reed, who grew up in Texas in the 20th century. as a young Black girl, and she's written a book on Juneteenth, talking about her own personal story, growing up Black in Texas in the 20th century, and remembering and commemorating Juneteenth.
That's so interesting. Commemorating Juneteenth during a time when you have Jim Crow, when you have unbelievable racism, segregation, the KKK, the lynching. Uh, does that say something about the community's constant feeling of striving for liberty, no matter what? Constantly
Yeah,
coming back, coming back, coming
absolutely.
back.
And I think it's actually a mark of resistance. Black people, even when they paraded in the North, marking their emancipation, they met with a lot of racial assaults from mobs, racist mobs, and so I think it's an act of resistance to say, "I will commemorate emancipation and freedom in your face." And actually, interestingly enough, immediately after the Civil War, Black people were commemorating July 4th, Independence Day, and Confederates would not commemorate it, but Black people did as a mark of loyalty to the American Republic. And so and these are all political acts to mark Independence Day, even Memorial Day, which began with African Americans commemorating the Union dead as Decoration Day, that today we mark as Memorial Day. These are all acts of resistance, recalling a history, but also recalling, emancipation and saying, no matter what, we are free. Slavery is dead. And that, believe me, for many white Southerners might have been, especially Southern elites, former slave owners, a difficult thing to stomach.
Right. Well, everything that we've talked about today, it's history, but we're still involved in that struggle. Everything that you've said leads us to say, when they tell us it's history and you can only talk about it and teach it this way, it's here with us this very, very day. It's going to be here tomorrow, the next day, Juneteenth. It's going to be here in our elections in November and in 2024. It's part of the American experience. And I know some people that I talk to are pessimistic. I don't think you should ever be pessimistic as an
I don't
American.
think
What
so.
are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important not to make this into a black versus white issue. It's a issue of decency and humanity versus a racist minority. They're loud, they storm the Capitol rather than accept the results of a democratically conducted election. There are many people in one particular political party who enable them. But I think if you're a decent American citizen and if you're a true patriot, you have to decide which side you're on. Are you on the side of the Union or the Confederacy? And are you on the side of those people who still live up to the ideas of the Confederacy or of the Union or the American Republic and its founding, or things that we have gotten rid of, like slavery? There's a reason why Black people celebrated emancipation, even in the worst of circumstances in this country. And I think it's a struggle. It's a struggle to preserve human freedom and democracy. So it's really not a white and black issue. It's a issue of decency and humanity versus the racists. Because the moment you start making it into a black and white issue is exactly what the racists want. They want you to think that you have some sort of white identity that is under threat, which is a ridiculous idea. We are all human beings. There's no such thing as races, according to the scientists. We may all look different. We may have different cultures. We may come from different places. But the greatness of the American experiment is that American citizenship, national birthright citizenship established by the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution after the war, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, is based on civic ideals. It's not based on an ethnic identity. And this country has seen a lot of nativism against even European immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, against Catholics, against Jewish people, against Irish immigrants. We really don't need to go down the path where we sow more divisions rather than be unified as American citizens with only one loyalty. And that loyalty is to the American experiment in democratic government. We can disagree on policies, but if you do not owe that civic loyalty to our democracy and believe in human equality, in the ringing words of the Declaration of Independence, then you're in the wrong country.
Well, Manisha, I don't think I can top your summary. I'm so happy you came on today. I'm looking forward to talking to Ben Haith and celebrating more about Juneteenth. And thank you so much for your scholarship, your grace, your wonderful explanations. And we'll have you back again because you explain and tell us so many important things that Americans need to know. So thank you so much. And I don't think we mentioned that you are at the University of Heidelberg in Germany now as a visiting lecturer for the summer. Have a wonderful time, and we'll see you back in Connecticut or online as this enables us to do. So thank you so much. You appreciate it very much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you all next time on Talk Back with Ben Haith, the designer of the Juneteenth flag. Bye for now.